pervasive beliefs have momentum. All of the beliefs of my colleague Richard Flair calls it the culture of separation. And the culture of separation is what separated us from God, separated us from one another, separated us from nature, and separated us from our own soul and divine purpose. And so what's happened is that we are still operating under this old operating system that is kept in place by the pervasive culture of separation, whether that be the culture of separation that's pushing uh, dominator religion, or whether it's the culture of separation that's pushing dominator science. Those dominate or be dominated beliefs pervade our consciousness.
Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Coelho, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We draw from a wide assortment of ancient wisdom and leading-edge studies in science, consciousness, philosophy, spirituality, healing, by hosting online presentations featuring guest speakers and also offering classes and study groups all on Zoom. And on our YouTube channel, we have the speakers. You can view over 150 of our guest speaker video recordings on our YouTube channel, Caritas Consciousness Project, and also on the video library page of our website, which is Caritas, CaritasCenter.org, sorry. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep Caritas going. So if you like what we do and you like tonight's presentation, consider becoming a member on our website. You do get benefits. So tonight, I'm very excited to present our good friend, Steve Bhaerman, who we've had a number of times, but usually just strictly comedy. And this tonight is, I don't know if it'll be strictly business, not business, but important topics, maybe sprinkled with a little comedy here and there, I hope. So I thank you, Steve. Please feel welcome and appreciated for coming tonight. Always love to have you. And here's the book that we're going to be talking about. It's called Spontaneous Evolution, Our Positive Future and a Way to Get There from Here. And I just finished it yesterday, and I really enjoyed it so much. It covers so much ground. We won't even come close to covering all of it in this interview, but I'm going to do my best to cover as much as possible. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, showing the cover of that book, I remember when the book came out in 2009, the first interview that Bruce and I had was on the Coast to Coast all-night program, Coast to Coast. And they made a big deal out of the Sunday before the book came out. A crop circle appeared that was the exact cover of that book. So,
oh wow!
I guess we must have had some. Our publicists must be working overtime for that. So.
That's amazing. And where was the crop circle?
Oh, it was in the UK. He was in the UK.
Okay.
It might have been a man-made crop circle. They're man-made, and there's other ones. But.
Yeah, Steve. What? Just to start, what drew you and Bruce Lipton together to write Spontaneous Evolution? How did your different backgrounds, biology and comedy, spiritual satire, shape the way the book took form?
Well, it all began in 2005, and Bruce had just published The Biology of Belief, which it turns out is probably one of the best-selling self-published books in the world. And a
wonderful.
mutual friend of ours, Donna Warden, had been trying to get us to meet Bruce and his wife Margaret for many. We had actually met Margaret before. I'd met Bruce briefly at conferences, but never really um, got to know him. And so Bruce and Margaret live in Bonnie Doon, which is outside of Santa Cruz, up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So we worked it out. I think it was February of 2005 that we were invited there to stay at their little guest house for the weekend. And we got there and we just started laughing. We laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. And we're going, what is it with these people? Oh, they're actually genuinely happy. And
Mhm.
they were so happy, in fact, this is true, that the dog next door actually adopted them and said, I want to live here. So they had a dog that adopted them. And so Bruce and I very immediately began to have conversations, and he's got a great sense of humor. That's why we laughed so much throughout the whole thing. And we both had a love for American history, and we started talking about a book that we were going to call The American Evolution, because we recognized that there were certain principles in American politics and the founding of the country that was resonant with what Bruce perceived as our evolutionary future. So later that year, we just decided we were going to write a book. I was actually out walking, out on a hike, and I had always wanted to write a book called Healing the Body Politic. And I wanted to write it with a great scientist. I was thinking of, Larry Dossey or Bernie Siegel. I knew both of them. And then I went, wait a minute. It's Bruce. I'm writing this book with Bruce. And so that's what happened. And so after, that next winter, Bruce went to teach in New Zealand. And after coming back from there, we realized that the American evolution was a little bit too narrow because we recognized that this is a worldwide conversation. And so we had what we called a tidal wave. And Bruce and his wife, Margaret, and Trudy and I, my wife and I, we just sat and we brainstormed all day. We put all kinds of possible titles up on the whiteboard and so on. And we like spontaneous evolution because it's reminiscent of spontaneous remission. And looking at the current worldwide, the new word is situation, the situation that we're in, it looks like we could use a good spontaneous remission. That all of the natural markers are going. Oh man, I think this is heading downhill, and yet there are these miraculous cases where there is a spontaneous remission. And we realized that our spontaneous remission as a society would actually involve a spontaneous remissioning and changing our mission collectively from it's every individual for themselves to we're all in it together. And so that's how we came up with the title. It took us 3 years to write the book. As I said, we laughed the whole time. We were very fortunate that Hay House picked it up, and it's in, I think, 25 languages. It's not in Pig Latin or Esperanto, but it's in most of the other languages. And every chapter begins with a humorous quote from the Swami. And so I'm looking at, I can understand how they translated it into Spanish or German, but somehow Hungarian or Korean, I'm not quite sure how they did that, but
Sometimes humor, kind of loses something in translation.
yeah.
So I love the quote. There's good news and bad news.
Yeah.
The bad news is civilization as we know it is about to end. The good news is civilization as we know it is about to end. I love that quote.
Well, that was just a prediction back then, and we're seeing it now.
We sure are. Yeah.
Apocalypse. The term apocalypse means lifting of the veils, and the veils are being lifted on all of these secrets and all of these toxic doings that have come from, 5,000 plus years of living by the rule of the lowest common denominator, where the golden rule's been overruled by the rule of gold. So what we're seeing right now, as painful as it is to look at, and many people are suffering because of it, it's a necessary phase of dismantling so that something else can happen in its place. So
Yeah,
I think
I
that's why that quote was so relevant then.
yeah, yeah. I agree that things need to be dismantled. I don't agree as to how they are being dismantled, but that's another story.
Yeah.
So the book talks about what you call myth perceptions. Myth perceptions.
MIT,
I don't have a
MITH,
list.
myth perceptions. You got to have a little bit of a lisp.
I don't have a list. It's myth perceptions, common misperceptions or false myths underpinning our culture, such as only matter matters, or evolution is random, or survival of the fittest, or it's all in the genes. So which of these myth perceptions do you find most pernicious or hardest to overturn in people's minds, and why?
Well, every one of them. I'll go through every one of them.
Yeah.
They're all tenets of the current religion. Bruce talked about the black-coated priests and now the white-coated scientists who are now the experts. And science is great. Science is a phenomenal tool, and we owe a lot to the explorations of science. However, there was a divorce that happened about 500 years ago, and that was the divorce between science and between the physical and the spiritual world, where science got custody of the physical world and religion got custody of spirituality. And you can see that a society where these two are at odds with each other and where the breach is growing stronger is bound to collapse because it's not integrated. So, in a certain regard, we've seen the swinging of there's been a paradigm shift from monotheism, the religion that many of us grew up in, our various religions, to scientific materialism, which says that only the material world is real. Now, it so happens that the vast majority of the people on the planet, estimated 80 to 90%, believe in some transcendent power, believe that there is a higher power, something beyond the physical world, whether it's called the Great Mystery or God or Great Spirit or the transcendent, whatever it is. And even people who characterize themselves as atheists often believe in this. But our mainstream culture, scientific materialism, the dominating paradigm, the paradigm that runs Wikipedia and calls my colleague Bruce Lipton a quack, that paradigm is based on the belief that only the material world is real. That all of these things, all of the things that most of the people I think on this call know in their hearts are just superstition. They're just superstition. They're magical beliefs. And those of us who are evolved enough to make science our God, we already know the truth and we don't need no stinking religion. So, and of course, Einstein himself disproved it by saying that the field is the sole governing agency over matter. So in other words, if you were to do the experiment you did in junior high school, and you take some iron filings and put them on a piece of paper, they spew randomly. But if you put a magnet underneath, naturally, they arrange themselves according to this magnetic force. Now, we understand magnetics, so we understand why these particles arrange themselves, the iron filings arrange themselves. But what other kinds of invisible forces are there? What other kinds of fields exist that we are not yet familiar with that move around the particles? as we'll find out when we talk about the idea of only that our genes are our destiny, that there's a new science that Bruce helped found over the last 40 or 45 years called epigenetics. And epigenetics talks about, it means above genetics, above the genes. So what is it that activates some of these genes that are associated with certain diseases, etc.? Well, it turns out it's environmental factors that activate these genes. It's environmental factors that that actually create the possibility of overriding these genes. So that's another way of disproving that only the material world is real. There's an entire science of epigenetics working above the material, and there's entire fields of energy medicine now that are not moving around the particles, but are actually creating the field, the magnetic and electronic field to move those particles separately. Let me talk about the other two myths that are equally important. So one of them is that survival of the fittest. And as you go more deeply into that, you find that this is really all based on the work of Malthus, who preceded Darwin by a century or so, Thomas Malthus, and it was a belief in essentially the scarcity of things, and that we were essentially involved in a fight for survival. The truth is, it's not the survival of the fittest, as Bruce would say, it's the non-survival of the non-fittest. So when a lion is chasing a pack of wildebeests, it's not going for the fastest wildebeest in the crowd. It's going for the laggy up behind, who is weak, either weak or old or whatever. And so in a certain regard, it's not those, it's actually the non-survival of the non-fittest. But now, as we've learned more about the evolutionary process and what's been called punctuated equilibrium, we find that for long, long periods of time, there's virtually no evolutionary change. And all of a sudden, there were factors that spark this change. In fact, even Darwinism has been modified, because if you're purely Darwinist and evolution is purely random, then it's like the infinite number of monkeys on an infinite number of typewriters can reproduce the works of Shakespeare. And I think it should be apparent that there is purpose and intention behind evolution and behind life. So I think that there have been a number of pieces that have kind of shown that we're not that really cooperation and collaboration and symbiogenesis is what allows an entire ecosystem to evolve together. So I think that, but still, we still have a society that's based on only the material world is real, and that's why we're looking for material solutions to spiritual problems. We have a society that's based on when push comes to shove, whoever does harder pushing and harder shoving will win. We have a society that's based on medicine that is only focused on the physical body, that's only focused on the genes and the genetics, and seems to want to eliminate the entire rest of existence that can't be seen. And we have this theory of evolution that does not take into consideration purpose and intention.
Right, and the survival of the fittest encourages competition instead of cooperation, and that's the basis for evolution, is competition instead of cooperation, which we know. I mean, science has already shown that that's not true, but people still continue to believe it.
In spontaneous evolution, we quote William McDonough, who was an architect and designer, wrote a book called Cradle to Cradle. And he said that in the original Greek meaning, the word competition meant to strive together. So when these runners in the Olympics were running in the Olympics, they were not looking to beat the other runner. They were looking to use the other runners as kind of pace cars to keep their own pace. So I think that definition of competition, striving together, allows us each to do our personal best in the context of we want to create a healthy, wealthy Commonwealth.
Mhm.
So it's a good reframe. I like that, and I use it all the time.
Healthy, wealthy Commonwealth.
A healthy, wealthy Commonwealth that's uncommonly wealthy and uncommonly healthy.
Yeah, and also the idea that evolution is random. So talk about creationism versus evolutionism. Is it an either or is it a both and?
Well, there's an interesting idea. Let's imagine, and I tend to, working with Richard Flyer, I could talk to you more about that book, which I think is a sequel to Spontaneous Evolution. But there's the question: is there a transcendent power? Is there a higher power that one might call God, one might call divine love, that pre-existed the physical world and lives above and beyond it? Now, the great mystery is the great mystery. The great mystery didn't begin with the Big Bang, as far as I'm concerned. It's only my theological view. The great mystery exists, it pre-exists. And, those people who've been to heaven and back, have had these transcendent, not near-death experiences and all of that, they report that where there's no time, everything that's ever existed always exists. So inside the time-space capsule that we're in, we're limited by time, we're limited by space. But outside of that, everything that has ever existed exists in that field. And one of the books that I read, 40 books to write my part of Spontaneous Evolution, and one of the books that I wrote was that I read was Lynn McTaggart's book on the field. And what she said is that everything already exists, and in this physical domain, things are brought into existence on a need to exist basis. So we don't have everything happening all at once because it'd be very confusing. I mean, I think that dancing and eating and singing and going to the bathroom should be done at separate times, not all at once. But so time is what allows all of those things to happen. And so in this physical world of time and space, things are spaced out over time. However, I do sense that everything that has ever existed exists now. So it's quite possible that the template for every one of those animals pre-existed. And as evolution unfolded as a realization, as life learning about itself, then these things manifest. It's kind of like a paint by the numbers and the colors getting filled in. So I could see that I could see that somebody would say, I obviously the universe is not 6,300 years old, as some of the fundamentalist religious people say, but it's not a purely random process that where monkeys are typing away on typewriters.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good answer. So let's talk a little bit about the punctuated equilibrium. So as you already mentioned, in contrast to Darwin's theory that evolution is a very slow moving gradual process over millions of years, in the book you talk about what you call punctuated equilibrium, that nature as well as civilization consists of long periods of stasis interrupted by these sudden dramatic upheavals. And so it seems as though we're in a time of, when I was reading that part, I thought it feels like we're in a time of contradictory cycles with, on the one hand, a very entrenched dominator culture in which the mainstream dogmatic science, as you said, and also political structures and destructive industrial practices dictate and maintain the status quo in the face of impending climate catastrophe and possible extinction of humanity. And on the other hand, there's this growing movement of awakening consciousness and multicultural efforts towards healing and cooperation that I keep hoping will reach critical mass in time to effect a global shift.
Before we get to critical massacre, yes, I know. Yeah.
Before the critical massacre. Yeah. And where would you say we stand in this cycle presently? So
I really like the metaphor. Nori Huddle and Elizabeth Sahtouris and several other people, including Bruce, came up with this idea. In fact, Nori wrote a book called The Butterfly. And this is how this is the chrysalis. We're in the chrysalis right now. The butterfly, the caterpillar and the butterfly have the exact same DNA. Mm-hmm. And the caterpillar is a creature that eats, I think it's like 500 times its own weight in food while it's alive, while it's a caterpillar. And then it goes into the chrysalis. And what happens in the chrysalis is it begins to deconstruct, it begins to dissolve, and the caterpillar cells begin to fall apart. And in the midst of this chaos, what would look like chaos from any viewpoint, there are these new cells called the imaginal cells. That's what they're actually called, the imaginal cells. And these imaginal cells begin to emerge. And at first, because there's not many of them, the dominant caterpillar culture that's falling apart doesn't let them survive. But at some point, these imaginal cells begin to communicate with one another, and they begin to cohere. And at some point, there's a critical mass, and that becomes the butterfly. So there's an inevitability. It's like I saw that. There's an inevitability that the caterpillar doesn't go, I think I want to go back to be a caterpillar. It doesn't ever happen that way. It always moves forward to the butterfly. Now we are in that chrysalis. I don't know how long it's going to last, but it's really if you can appreciate that all of the structures that no longer serve are deconstructing. And I could talk about this more later, but I read an article a number of years ago after I was in shock and not awe over the first election of Donald Trump. I start to figure out, what brought this about. And there was an article by Andrew Markell, and it talked about the failure of progressivism in the liberal mind. And it said that that progressivism in our civilization is simply the other side of all of the extraction, that it allows the extraction to continue. It just seeks to mitigate the extraction to a certain extent, but it will never actually confront the extractive system itself. So I just read that in the first 50 years of the war on poverty, it cost, I think it was $22 trillion spent on the war on poverty. And my joke is, yes, the war on poverty is over. The poor people have all surrendered, right? So having grown up in a housing project in a poor neighborhood in the 50s and 60s, I can tell you that that $22 trillion has not moved the dial. But what it has done is it's created a poverty industrial complex, a structure and bureaucracy that stays in place, and even though people may have the best of intentions, essentially keeps the shit going. Okay? So now in this last election, what happened was for some reason, a lot of those things needed to be destroyed. Um, the collateral damage, I mean, I look at it this way. I think that we're basically facing two rival gangs of oligarchs, the sharks and the jets. We all know who the sharks are, right? But the jets are the jet setters who jet set around the planet, who promise you'll own nothing and be happy, right? Those people. And they have this veneer of beneficence, but they're nonetheless dominators and extractors with a kinder face. And so we are caught between these two dueling oligarchs, each of which has created a, um, a cultural narrative in opposition to the other cultural narrative to make sure that the two sides never actually compare notes and unite and go, wait a minute, we could do without both of these sides. Okay, so it's a long way of saying that right now we have the great opportunity to fill that vacuum and create the sane and sacred center that has been missing in our civilization, that's been filled by the power of money, materialism, and the machine.
And reconciling the opposites, reconciling. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's quite a challenge, and I hope we can be equal to it. So in the chapter, A Whole New Story, you present the idea that narrative is foundational and that the stories we tell ourselves and tell each other shape reality. Would you elaborate on that?
You know, I imagine that if we took the average activist, peace activist, environmental activist, et cetera, and using kinesiology, I'm sure many people in the call know kinesiology, muscle testing, to test congruency, and you went, I believe that we can have peace on the planet. Doink, it's going to test weak. And it's going to test weak because the pervasive beliefs have momentum. All of the beliefs of my colleague Richard Flyer calls it the culture of separation. And the culture of separation is what separated us from God, separated us from one another, separated us from nature, and separated us from our own soul and divine purpose. And so what's happened is that we are still operating under this old operating system that is kept in place by the pervasive culture of separation, whether that be the culture of separation that's pushing uh, dominator religion, or whether it's the culture of separation that's pushing dominator science. Those dominate or be dominated beliefs pervade our consciousness. And we don't really believe that we're up to the task. And the way I know that is how fervently people hate one another now. You know, my joke is that we've gone way past rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Now the two sides are actively throwing them at each other. And so what that means is that because people don't really have confidence that, you know, collectively through our collective wisdom and through spiritual coherence, that we can actually take on some of these wicked problems that we're facing and solve them, it's much easier to simply blame the other side when let the Titanic go down and say, see, it's their fault. So part of the maturing process that we're being called on, I call it the great upwising. 4 steps: wake up, wise up, grow up, show up. Wake up to the illusion of separation and recognize that if you're on one side or another in this political fight, chances are you've been captured by a narrative. The more fervently you believe that narrative, the more deeply you're captured. Number 2, wise up to the power of loving coherence. That when a community, when an individual or a family or a neighborhood or a community or a country cultivates this sane and sacred center above and beyond religion and non-religion, then it changes the entire field. It's a coherent field of love, and then the particles, that is, our behaviors and our structures of society, can rearrange themselves based on this new structure. So you were talking about narratives. Andrew Breitbart said that politics is always downstream from culture. So that means that when the culture changes, the politics will follow. But right now, the politics is so intense and people are so bought into this side or that they haven't been able to change the culture. So the imaginal cells are not on this side or that side. The imaginal cells are emergent, and instead of a state of emergency, they're in a state of emergency. Emerge and see how we're connected and how coherent we are. The third step of the uprising, grow up from children of God to adults of good. In other words, look to connect the good and the goodness in your region wherever you are, and stop the blame and shame game. Move beyond those narratives. Look beyond that. What is required right now is a level of spiritual maturity that I believe we're capable of. I believe that when there are more coherent forces that make themselves known, those forces are magnetizing. And if there's a field of intentional mutual benefit, it will magnetize more people to it. And finally, the fourth step is show up on a new playing field ready to play a new game. Off of the battlefield. Every day when you're looking at your news feed, start to, and you notice that you're plugged in, notice what's plugging you in and ask yourself, is this narrative manipulating me to feel this way or that way? I'm an equal opportunity masochist, so I get them from left and right. I'm on all the news feeds. And you start to see the pattern. And the pattern is, did you see what those bastards did? Send us $3. That's the pattern, okay?
That is the pattern.
And then finally, there's a fifth step. I'm going to offer a fifth step, and that is take a vow of levity. Mm-hmm. Because levity helps us rise above the gravity of the situation. It gives us perspective. It brings joy and understanding to the situation, and it helps us think more creatively, takes us out of the survival, fight or flight or fright mode, and puts us into our most creative, generative space.
Yeah, we were talking before we got started about just how important levity and humor is. And I was saying I'm currently in Brazil visiting my daughter, and the culture here is it's a joyful culture. I mean, it's got its problems. The country has its problems. Every country does. But, the people are, the harder things get, the more they find to laugh at. It's very interesting what a balancing force laughter and joy is. They just play more music, they dance more, they laugh more. So
it reminds me of we live in our Anglo culture. I mean, there's a lot of the Northern European, very reserved, not like the Italians, not like the Spaniards, not like the Portuguese, very reserved. So this story about Will Rogers, the great American humorist, is doing a presentation in Maine. And in Maine, these people are known for being taciturn, right? And he's doing his comedy, and the audience looks like this. I mean, it's imagine being a comedian. Hey, I'm playing Mount Rushmore. All these stone faces. So after the show, one of the stone faces comes up to him and says, "That was the funniest thing I ever heard. It was all I could do to keep from laughing." So don't be like that guy.
Okay, so you describe civilization as a superorganism with each of us as cells in its body. What does this metaphor illuminate how would you describe using the cellular intelligence as a metaphor for, how we could improve our civilization and, community? Could you take us down that path that from single cell organisms to the body and how it sustains itself and the economy, and I mean it's just parallels everything.
Okay, good. Let's start with the with what's called symbiogenesis, and that is how life, the story of life on this planet. It's it's like a five-act play, right? Five-act play. So the first act, how did life begin? The native peoples talk about Mother Earth and Father Sun, Father Sky, and that's exactly what happened. Uh, the energy from the sun, the light from the sun, activated what was inorganic matter, mater, mother, on Mother Earth, and that created life. It created the first um, single cell organisms. And these single cell organisms existed for a long, long, long time. However, at some point, it was not beneficial for them to be single because a single cell can only expand so much. The cell membrane, which was what holds the cell together, I mean, it's kind of like a water balloon, right? So at some point, if you fill a balloon with enough water, it's going to burst. So a cell can only hold a certain amount of energy and information. And at some point in evolution, the cell said, I'm tired of being single. And so they evolved into multi-cell organisms. Now, what happens with multi-cell organisms is all of a sudden you have access to um, other cells, other that you can. You've already had enough information in this cell. Now you have access to information in other cells. And so these multi-cell organisms at the next stage of evolution evolved into more complex organisms like you and me. We are, it's estimated that we are 50 trillion cells in our body. And hey, the cells all get along. They communicate. We have full employment, a thriving economy, no cell left behind. So in an organism like we are, we have specialized cells. Now, what's really interesting is that the cells in the organ systems, the liver doesn't go, geez, I'm really worried about the heart. I hope the heart pumps some energy toward me, or I hope some food's digested soon. In other words, each of these organs or organelles or organ systems are contained and they have a job to do. Each of them has a job to do. The currency in the body is called ATP. And that is how energy is stored, how energy is distributed, and how energy is used. And what's very interesting is that the cells that have the most work to do, that are the most responsible, they get more energy. So in the body, the economy of the body is energy flows toward the most important processes. Everybody gets fed. Everybody gets fed. The lowly skin cell, it gets fed. It gets nourished. And so in the
and when there's a surplus, it goes to this common energy bank.
It goes to an energy bank, and then the energy flows toward that which. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I had some knee injuries, and so while my knee injuries were healing, and they all healed, no surgery, no nothing, while my knees were healing, I didn't have the energy to exercise the way I would normally exercise because the body was using that energy for the higher priority. And so the body wants to heal. The body really wants to heal. And given the opportunity, it will send its energy toward that which is the most urgent and most important and most foundational. and it'll make compensations for the other things, right? So in the economy of the body and in the politics of the body, there is something called the central voice. And the central voice is not a dictator. The central voice is a coordinator that helps coordinate where energy goes. And that's based on the overall well-being of that organism. So when we look in the mirror, we see us, but we're really a community of 50 trillion cells. Now, if we were to look at human society, there is no coherent central voice for human society that that has our health and benefit at its core. It's not a dictator, it's a coordinator, right? So each of the organ systems has its autonomy, and given the fact that there's enough energy, everybody gets fed. We've heard about stories about women who are anorexic can't get pregnant because the body says, I'm sorry, you with your nutrition cannot support another life. And so they stop menstruating. That's what happens. So that's how nature is. If we were as smart as ourselves, we would recognize that the best economy is based on mutual benefit. Yeah. The organs of the body are not holding back. The organs of the body are not, they're not being stingy. They're not being stingy. They're not being greedy. There are no oligarchs, in other words. So basically, the whole function of a body is mutual benefit for all the cells in the body. So in an economy or an ecology or in a political system with human beings, intentional mutual benefit. That is how the currency is to be used. And later on, if we have time, we can talk about some examples in real life of how societies like that have operated. Some right here on the planet right now as we speak.
Yes.
I want to make sure we have time for that. Okay.
Okay. Do you want to talk about it now?
Sure.
As illustrative of what we're discussing.
Yeah. The book in Spontaneous Evolution has 3 parts. And the third part of the book is really about changing the guard and regrowing the garden. Changing the guard meaning changing the belief systems that stand as the sentinel and have kept us barefoot and pregnant, so to speak. And then regrowing the garden, that is the mission of this new paradigm. The new holistic paradigm is to regrow the garden from the grassroots up and have a heaven of a time doing it. So that's really the work that's the evolutionary work that's on tap. So in that section, one of the chapters was called Healing the Body Politic. And one of the projects that I found out about at that time was Conscious Community Network in Reno, Nevada. And at that time, 2006, a man named Richard Flyer, Flyer, who had been part of some peace group, who had the inquiry, how can we unite the community of Reno at a time when we're divided? That time it was the war in Iraq was dividing people. And so they realized that this was a time when the big box stores were coming to town and Walmart was nudging out the downtown area. And so they came up with the idea of a buy local network. So I read about this Conscious Community Network. They created a buy local network that totally changed Reno. Because when money keeps circulating around the community over and over and over again, that every time money is exchanged, value is exchanged. So the more people are exchanging money, even if it's the same $20 over and over and over again, each time that $20 is spent, value gets created. If people keep that $20 in their pocket for a year, that value does not get created because people can't afford to buy it. So first of all, they revitalized the economy in Reno. They were radically inclusive. Any business that was local could be part of this. And businesses changed their perspective because they recognized that they had to serve their customers. So this was a time that many of the dry cleaners in town changed what they were using from toxic to non-toxic because they wanted to serve their customers. The next thing they did was they created a local food network. Now, there was a agrarian economist back in the 1930s and 40s named Carl Wilkin. And Carl Wilkin said all new wealth comes from the soil. Now, if you think about it, renewable wealth, when food is grown, renewable wealth comes up. The farmer harvests the food, gets paid for the food by the customers, uses that money to buy clothes for his kids, send them to college, pay for equipment, and so on. And it's not a trickle-down economy, it's a bubble-up economy. A bubble-up economy. See what I'm saying? So when you have a local community where food is being grown locally, it's renewable wealth. Renewable wealth. Oh, I'm growing cabbages. I could be in the kimchi business. People do that. Oh, I'm growing tomatoes. I can make salsa. And so what happened in Reno was that an entire food economy burgeoned. They were set to develop all of this area around Reno. There was a plan to, pave paradise and put up the parking lot, so to speak. And what happened was there was so much of a demand for locally grown food that they needed that farmland. So when they were setting up the local food network, there were people who said, we only want to have organic farmers. And Richard thought about it and he said, no, we want to include everybody. We want to have everybody who's growing food as part of this local food network, radically inclusive. Well, guess what happened? The biggest conventional grower in the area decided to go organic after a year because he saw that there was a demand for that. So in the buy local and in the local food network, you're, first of all, local food, you're creating wealth rather than importing it. Richard worked in poor neighborhoods in San Diego and noticed that all of the money was flowing out of the neighborhoods. Absentee businesses, absentee landlords. No money stayed in the community. And so in Reno, he actually talked to the big universities and the state government and the businesses and said, why don't you buy locally? And so all of a sudden, more money was being spent locally, more resource was circulating locally. And then with more food being grown locally, more wealth was being pumped into the economy from the bottom up. So for the last 3 years, we just finished the project, and the book will be out early in 2026. I helped Richard Flyer and I helped Richard write his book called Birthing the Symbiotic Age, Ancient Blueprint to Unite Humanity. And it's based on the work that he did in Reno, which was based on the work of Dr. Arya Ratne, who founded the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka, starting in 1958, working with the most untouchable of the untouchables, the lowest of the low-class people who had nothing. And now it is a thriving network of 5,000 village economies where they have their own businesses, they grow their own food, their own schools, they have their own banks. And in 2022, when there was a famine there, which was caused by political issues, Sarvodaya, not the government, not the nonprofit, Sarvodaya fed the country by having everybody bring their food to the local child care centers. So what I'm saying is that there is a way for this to happen now. These experiments are ongoing, and I could talk about more of them, but I want to stop there and see what else you want to know. Maybe it'll come up in the Q&A.
That's really fascinating and inspiring. Let's see, what else shall I ask you? For those who are scientifically minded or trained in reductionist paradigms, what is your strongest argument that can open their thinking?
Well, I think all you have to do is look at the medical system, which is based on reductionism. Everybody has their own specialty. And so there is nobody in that. I mean, of course, there's holistic forces that are operating, but they're kind of very marginalized. They are in the medical system, they are the imaginal cells being snuffed out. And so it's very, very common. I think Gary Null wrote a book a number of years ago called Death by Medicine. And when he wrote the book, iatrogenic causes, that is, medicine itself, was the third greatest cause of death after heart disease and cancer. Medicine itself, because looking at these separate systems as isolated in this reductionist system, it's quite common for people to be seriously afflicted by and or die from medications that are conflicting. They're taking one thing for their diabetes, they're taking something else for another condition, taking
For the
something
side
else.
effects of the first medication.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that entire medical system is based on reductionism. And we can have a look, and we have the most expensive medical system in the universe, and yet we're like number 36 in health. What's wrong with this picture? Iron deficiency, right? That's what we're suffering from.
Yeah. So some evolutionary biologists might argue that large-scale social change is better explained through institutional, economic, or structural shifts rather than belief change. How do you see belief change interacting with those material forces?
Well, I think if we want to look at the power of how material forces work, how well did the Soviet Union work? How well did communist China work? Because when you're only dealing with materialism, and this is true in this country, I think the entire woke movement with good intentions is misguided because it's looking at imposing a structure from the top down that is devoid of spirit. It's only about material, right? So every material solution, I mean, think about the ultimate material solution, transhumanism. We're all going to become machines. So when you start to look at top-down structures as making changes, my background's political science, I think of Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So when you create top-down power, particularly when you have the true definition of fascism is the intertwining, like fascia in our skeletal structure, the true intertwining of political power and economic power, corporations and government. And we've had up until this last election, we've had what I would call soft cloth totalitarianism. That it has a friendly face, but essentially there's censorship based on the parameters of what you're allowed to see on mainstream media, censorship based on Wikipedia deciding what's scientifically true and what isn't, and everybody who is not in that paradigm inside their box is called a science denier, a quack, and so on. And I have to say that it's been I've been very disappointed at so many of my very, very smart friends and colleagues who have fallen prey for that narrative. Follow the science, to me, might as well be, how do I know the Bible tells me so? Because we're not talking about science as in real science, as a scientific process. We're talking about scientific dogma.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about. So I think that top down Many of the people that I know who've been working in the field for so many years are still in this top-down. We're going to work with the UN. We're going to work with all these organizations. And the basic thing is that these organizations cannot be transformed from the inside. I'll tell you a story. How many people have heard of parallel polis? I hadn't. Parallel polis. In Czechoslovakia in the 1970s, Václav Havel, who I bet many people have heard of because he was a philosopher and he became the prime minister of Czechoslovakia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And another Václav Benda, who was a Catholic personalist. Now, Catholic personalism, what does that mean? It means, since we're all children of God, let's treat each other like that. That's Catholic personalism. Very radical, very radical. Unheard of. But anyway, so they decided that instead of resisting the communist regime, they would create a parallel society alongside it. So in the Soviet republics at that time, religion was banned. You could not practice religion. Many of the cultural practices were verboten. And then you had Pravda, supposedly truth, which would be the top down, which is a lot like our media now, Pravda. I call it CBS, where there's plenty of BS to see. Well, you're only allowed to see BS. And so they had to, down is up and up is down. And if you've ever been in a situation where you've had to pretend that a lie is true, let's say you're at a workplace and there's something that this workplace believes in, but in order to keep your job, you cannot say anything, even though in your heart and all of your heart and soul, you know it's wrong. Sometimes it's in a relationship where in order to stay in a relationship, you have to subvert your own knowing. Well, in Czechoslovakia and in the Soviet countries at that time, you could not speak the truth. You had to pretend and you had to live a lie. And there's something exceedingly spiritually disheartening about living a lie. And so the two Václavs, Václav Havel and Václav Benda, created this parallel polis. And they began to meet in small groups. They began to have their own church services. They began to have their own community gatherings. They had potlucks, and it spread throughout the whole country. And then they started having barter exchanges. They started having teach-ins. They had their own libraries. And what happened was, the more people wait a minute, we all agree about this. More people started speaking the truth, so that hastened the fall of that regime. And when the Soviet Union fell, Václav Havel had created the alternative parallel culture that became the new government and new society. It wouldn't have happened without the culture. Politics follows culture.
And it reminds me of the quote, I'll have to paraphrase, by Bucky Fuller, to change things, you don't resist the existing order, you just create a new model that makes the existing model obsolete.
Well, the Bucky starts here.
Yeah.
I think that's what we need to do. But you know what happens is we get pulled into these narratives. Donald Trump is an evil Nazi. I mean, my opinion of Donald Trump has not changed since 2016. He's no better in my heart and mind than he was back then. However, I recognize that he is not the disease. He is the opportunistic infection. And so once you start to go, well, what is the disease? And what do we have to do to fight the disease? The disease is divide and conquer. The solution is unite and prevail. The solution is create a parallel polis of independent thinking people who may identify as Democrat or Republican or independent, who may have their preferences, who may be deeply religious or atheistic, but who also recognize that we are all cells in the same body. And if we want to create a healthy, wealthy body politic, we have to unite and focus on, instead of the identity issues that keep us divided, the identical issues that we're all facing. Clean air, clean water, clean food, and clean government. That's what breaks the trance of separation. That's what's required right now. That butterfly has not evolved yet to become we haven't reached critical mass there, but that is happening. It's not being reported because the mainstream media is owned by one of the sides that wants to keep the battle going.
Yeah. Totally agree. There's a statement that I wrote down: becoming conscious of our subconscious beliefs and programming is the gateway to spontaneous evolution. So to me, that is shadow work. Our perceptions, in the book, you mention that our perceptions come from 3 different sources. One is instinct, which is the genomic influence, the genes, instinct. 2 is subconscious memory, which is the conditioning or programming of our subconscious. And 3 is free will, the actions of the self-conscious mind. So could you explain that a little bit more? How do we become conscious of our subconscious beliefs? It reminds me of the quote by Jung, where he says, if we don't, then it comes at us from the outside and we call it fate, right?
Well, Jung was the one who said, what you resist persists. And that was part of that quote, and will outgrow to eat you up. So what's happening in our reactive world, when we wrote Spontaneous Evolution, we didn't have the dueling intensive algorithms of these opposing sides. We didn't have a 24/7 inundation with a narrative that painted the other side as evil. Jay Leno had the Tonight Show still and was doing humor that was about all sides, and it wasn't a battle. If you think about the soft cloth totalitarianism of the last period of time, name the conservative comedians that have been on the air in the last 20 years.
Conservative comedians. It sounds like an oxymoron.
Well, it's not. It's not. I mean, there are some really, really funny people who can't get on the air because their belief system contradicts this dominant paradigm. And it contradicts the dogma of transgenderism, wokeism, and all of these inventions that are a replacement for genuine compassion. 8 years ago, 2017, there was a book that came out that said basically everybody now accepts gay marriage in America. Everybody has a son or a daughter or a cousin or a brother or a sister. And they've resigned, they go, okay, let's all be family. What's happened? The culture wars have been intensified so that each side can have their issues to beat the other side. And so now we've gone backward. Now all of a sudden, if Aretha Franklin were alive today, or at least in the previous administration, she'd have to change her song to "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Person." It's, can I use bad language, fucking insane. And what happened in this last election is that most of the people that I know took exception to many of these extreme positions, but were afraid to speak out. So that common sense got, the other side got custody of common sense. And so what's happened is that since Spontaneous Evolution was written, there's even a more intense ginning up of opposition and resistance, which narrows our ability to solve problems and keeps us polarized. So that's a new factor. We didn't have that when we wrote that. We still had polarization. But one thing that Bruce emphasizes, and he always emphasizes this in his talk, is that until the age of 7, we are uh, we are in a hypnagogic state. Our brain waves are such that we are susceptible to programming. As the Jesuits said, give me your child until he's 7, bring me the child and I'll show you the man. So the idea is that what we learn during those times, whether we learn it from our parents, whether we learn it from our environment, whether we learned it from our school, that is what that becomes the structural invisible template for how we perceive everything else. So we're at a time right now, and this is a good thing, where trauma is being addressed and healed. Generational trauma is being addressed and healed. That there are certain patterns that have been existing in families for generations and generations and generations. And these patterns are in the process of being healed in this generation so it doesn't continue down the line. But we're all traumatized by this. And Tom Hartman, who you may know, Tom Hartman, a really very smart man, progressive radio show host, back in the 1990s, he was invited to speak to a group of Native Americans, a Native American group. And what he did was he went back and he talked about the destruction of Europe's indigenous culture. He's Norwegian, and he went all the way back to see how the indigenous people of Norway, and same will be true of Ireland and all of these other places, were destroyed by this dominator gene that and so on. So his point, and even though he and I talked about it a couple of years ago, it's not something popular right now. You don't want to bring in, God forbid, how white people were oppressed. God forbid we should talk about that. But we are all descended from that. The indigenous in every society was overrun by that power, and we have that trauma. We have that PTSD that we are here to metabolize. So it's a human universal thing. It's not just about people of color and white folks. That's just Western civilization. This is a pattern that goes back a long, 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 long time. So we have the programming of that, the trauma that we've inherited through and some of these are genetic. They've impacted our genome. They actually have impacted our genetic makeup. And then, of course, the cultural patterns. Then, of course, what we're learning, and then the polarization and the kinds of education that kids have gotten while we haven't been paying attention over the last 20 years, which is really a lot more like the Cultural Revolution in China than the American Revolution here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how do we go about making this unconscious programming conscious?
Well, first of all, I mean, any human being, and there's so much self-help out there that everybody has access to it. Any human being can monitor their thoughts and what's going across their mind, what's going across their skull. Where is this coming from? Is this about connection or separation? Is this the culture of separation trying to create an enemy? Or is it about the culture of connection that is wanting to unite us at the heart? And that's something that we could all do. We can, we don't have to be subject to our thoughts. Now, consciously, certain things we can change consciously. Other things we need to acknowledge. There are ways of reprogramming subconscious beliefs. And, there's a lot of practices right now. There's the tapping practices. There's the eye movement practices. Bruce used to promote Psyche, psychological kinesiology. And so there are ways of identifying the program and then addressing it. Something as simple as forgiveness, Ho'oponopono practice, where You forgive yourself for things. You forgive other people. There are many, many practices for release, but the first thing is becoming conscious of your own consciousness. Part of when somebody talked to Richard Flyer about he called it the conscious community network. He said actually it's about being conscious about when you're being unconscious. So that's the application. Then he also created these connections gatherings, which are being reintroduced when the book comes out as symbiotic circles, where you find circles of trust, other people that you know, who also want to create a world of mutual benefit and want to promote the culture of connection and are willing to face their own shadow and metabolize those things, love themselves and forgive themselves. Spiritual practice of some kind where you have access to a transcendent loving power that's bigger than any of us. That's a powerful thing. We didn't mention that, because we were not focused on religion. But think about it. There's many, many ways that people can access this higher power, and we need to have that. My friend Matthew Alexander and I just wrote a song that's coming out next year called "The Heart of the Matter is the Matter of the Heart," and I think that that's really what's true. Is that scientific materialism and what you talked about, reductionism, that has created a very, very mental society. And we think that the problems can all be solved by the mind. And we've deplatformed God. We've thrown the baby Jesus out with the bathwater. We've abandoned a resource that is more powerful perhaps than any mental structure or mental system that will always be subject to the ego, will never not be subject to the ego. So when you access this higher power, that's what the recovery groups are doing. That's the whole purpose behind that. You realize that you have this addiction that you're so enslaved by. They say, my best thinking got me here. And so part of the 12-step, the early steps is I realized that I do not have the power, meaning my mind, my limited egoic thinking does not have the power to liberate me from this addiction and affliction. It requires a higher power, and I surrender my lower power of my mind to this higher power, whatever I call it, universal love and truth. We need a recovery movement to recover our connection with the transcendent and recover from the society of the culture of separation. And so part of that is surrendering and going, we can't fix the system. We cannot fix this mentally constructed system. It's based on materialism. It's based on you versus me. We can't fix that system. However, we can cohere and create a parallel system that overgrows that system. And that's what spontaneous evolution is ultimately about.
Yeah. There's a quote that I just want to read that I especially like from your book. For those already involved with personal and spiritual growth, holistic health, and new thought, it's now time to apply that knowledge and wisdom to the world at large. It's time to move past the limitations of seeking out personal good fortune in isolation. It makes no sense to have a congruent life, but not a congruent world. In fact, it's time for the self-empowerment movement to take an emergent leap front and center to test spiritual principles in collective reality. So I really love that. And
did we write that? God, I can't. I mean that's what I'm working with right now. So we wrote that 16 years ago or more.
Yeah. Well, and I've always felt that, in the 60s and 70s when we were importing all the Eastern traditions, the Eastern religious traditions, we left out quite a bit. We imported it selectively. Like for instance, Buddhism, we left out, um, conscious service to all sentient beings. um, it became an isolated thing. I'm meditating, don't bother me. I'm seeking my enlightenment, don't bring me down, it, and yeah, so that quote really spoke to me in terms of, just the Aquarian principle is one of collectivity and humanitarianism, and that's what we need if we're going to be in coherence with what's happening, astrologically and energetically. The impulse that's in the air right now has to be towards that, and not, towards community. And yeah.
Wow, thanks for bringing in that quote. And I think there's some nuance to it, and that is that well-meaning collectivity cannot be imposed from the top down. It has to be realized from the grassroots up.
Yes.
Not as an imposition.
Yes, and that leads to, because I want to. Okay, we have a few more minutes before I want to open it up. Talk about the concept of humanity being the next step in our evolutionary journey, and what follows that, even, just in terms of thinking of ourselves as cells in one body, in one human body, humanity, right? Talk about that a little bit.
Well, the next stage of evolution is not growing a new arm or a bigger head or anything else. It's adding to. It's really crowdsourcing and connecting. What I didn't say when I talked about the symbiogenesis is that at every stage of evolution, from multi-cell to huge multi-cell communities like ourselves, the next step has been gathering our humans individual cells into tribes, and there's nothing wrong with that. But now it's time to gather the tribes into a coherent organism where intentional mutual benefit is the way of the world. The golden rule overrules the rule of gold. We go on the golden standard. And that is a spiritual, it's a spiritual awakening, but it's necessary for our survival right now. So at that point, Bruce had this great idea, and I agree, that once we become a coherent species and have that power of loving coherence at the center of our civilization, we will be able to be ushered into a galactic community. What were you people? We've been waiting for you. We've been waiting for you. A galactic community where Earth becomes a cell in a much larger conscious organism. So, where we're at right now is the necessity of having that as a vision, and recognizing that it's everybody gets to be who they are. And that's what's required for thrival. It's not a matter of, we're one of the great tenets of the American Revolution is bringing two aspects of what seems like a contradiction or paradox together, and that's reconciling individual freedom and agency and collective well-being. They are not opposites. They are partners. And so as we get to see that our individual well-being is enhanced by helping others. Sarvodaya, great example. When Dr. Ari began working with the very, very poor people who really didn't have any spiritual practice, he started with the four Buddhist noble truths. So they always had this spiritual foundation. Their slogan was, "We build the road and the road builds us." So as they built these alternative institutions, they were their own spiritual capacity to not just to access God or higher power, but to serve, to be of service. Very, very important. Transcendent becomes immanent. That's heaven on earth. Jesus said, love God, love thy neighbor. That's basic commandment. Some other great rabbi said, that's all you need. So love God, meaning connection with divine love. Love thy neighbor, bring that, become a radiant being of that heavenly energy in your words, your thoughts, your deeds, and create networks of mutual benefit.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. One last question about the HeartMath's Global Coherence Initiative. When I read the book, it mentions that. I wanted to know more. Can you tell us any more about that?
Well, they've been doing now that they started that before we finished the book. Greg Braden's been working a lot with heart math work. Um, Basically, heart math is about connecting the heart and the head,
Yeah,
which is very
coherent.
important.
Mhm.
So heart rate. So there's a brain in the heart. We have neurons in the heart and neurons in the head.
40,000.
Yeah, and so part of that is reconciling both of those. Now, their coherence project is seeing what impact our collective thinking and mind have on the world at large. So that's an ongoing experiment. I'm not, I was in touch with them, but not recently, so I don't know what they're doing right now. But they have people in all pockets of the world. The work was based on the work of Dean Radin, who was working with Institute of Noetic Sciences. And uh, Dean was working with random number generators,
Right,
computers that just generate random numbers. And he noticed that when large groups of people on the planet were thinking about the same thing, these numbers became more coherent. They became patterns.
right.
So, like when J.B. Rhine was doing his study of psychic abilities, he found that there were some people who were much better at guessing whether it was going to come to heads or tails. They were just much better at it. There are certain times that more people were better at it and less people were better at it. So something about there's some invisible field that allows us to know when something is going to happen and think about it. We all know that when there's an earthquake, the animals start preparing for it before we do. They know it's going to happen. A perfect example. Uh, what were the times of the greatest coherence? Well, according to Dean Radin, the O.J. Simpson trial, that was one. Princess Diana's funeral and the 9/11 Twin Towers attacks, right? Now, something very interesting about the Twin Towers attacks. About 2 hours or 3 hours before the attack, the numbers began getting more coherent.
Right.
So it's not something that happens instantly. So again, the concept of time gets bent. So it's kind of like dropping a pebble into a pool. The ripples go out in all directions. So the ripples go through time backward and forward, right?
Mhm.
So part of that coherence is what happens. Why did the random numbers become more coherent when more people were focused on the same thing? So that's the
Well,
question.
it's like the studies they did with which I also started with Gene Radin, but then the Heart Math Institute did more of them, um, where he would have someone watch random pictures. I mean, a random order of pictures on a computer screen, and had I think the heart hooked up. And some of the pictures were very calming and some of them were very disturbing. violent or
Mhm.
whatever. And when it was calming, there was no reaction. I mean, but when it was a disturbing picture, the heart reacted. I don't remember whether it was 2 seconds or what it was, or a couple of seconds before
Three seconds before it happened, the heart is
before the
reacting to
picture
it.
came on the
Yeah.
screen,
Yeah.
the heart would react to it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the same thing as the Global Consciousness Project. I was just wondering about that Global Coherence Initiative. I'm going to look into that more.
Yeah, do that. Tell me more about it.
Yeah, okay. All
Okay.
right. Well, let's open it up to whoever has a question or a comment.
Right here. That was so rich. So rich. I have a question and I don't know how to phrase it, so I'll just say what I'm thinking. What are you thinking about all the technology that's only going to get, I think, better? I mean, just more sophisticated and AI, and what's your take on that as far as our evolution as human beings being more loving and being one and raising the consciousness of this planet?
I think that it's a matter, the heart of the matter is the matter of the heart. And I think that it depends on whether artificial intelligence rules or real intelligence rules. We have to do more face to face to face to face. Reality is face to face. You can't do a deep fake when you're in your community. And I think that the solution to technology, the domination of technology, is the relocalization of life, meaning that more done at the local level, more food grown at the local level, more entertainment at the local level, more people getting together and connecting at the local level, face to face, and creating circles of trust. These circles of trust can become the new cells of the body politic. And then you may have circles of trust who want a better world in the Catholic community or in the Buddhist community or in the atheist or regen community. And then because they all know that we all are gathered around the same purpose, that trust can be extended from the grassroots up rather than having to rely on narratives from the top down. So the more we do face to face, the more we'll be able to manage technology rather than the other way around.
Interesting. I agree and well said, except I just worry about the kids and the teenagers who the cell phone, it's an epidemic.
It really is sad.
It really is.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at how the world has narrowed, it's a trance, and it may be that they're culturally altered forever. I don't know. I'm not in that world right now, but uh, Swami's going AI. I'm working with a guy who's created a cartoon Swami AI avatar. And so all of my comedy that I've done, that I've created for the last 40 years, goes into this big stew, and people can ask the Swami a question. And from that big stew, an animated Swami will provide an answer.
Well, that's
Uh,
fun.
yeah, and it'll be designed for people who are in that world to help them, access a bigger world, let's say.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I
Well,
think
thank you so much.
yeah, technology can be very helpful and it can also be very destructive. And I think the idea of transhumanism, merging technology with our bodies, is a negation of who we really are and our own evolutionary potential. Like, it's kind of an assumption that we've reached the highest pinnacle of what we can reach already. So now we need technology to enhance us more. And I just think
I would
that's
suggest that watching anything that Greg Braden has created in the last year or two, because he's addressing that issue. He is addressing the issue of when we use artificial substitutes, we actually lose our power to connect with the divine and our natural power to heal.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, we got
Glenn
Mark.
has his hand up. Glenn, unmute.
There he is.
Good.
There you go.
Awesome. Well, Steve, you're giving a face to the global consciousness, and I thank you for that. It's working. What you're talking about, it is happening. I'm going to testify, and it's an ongoing process. And I go back to Dante's time. He was a part of something called the Fideli di Amore, the faithful of.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what you are doing. That's what you're expressing, and those that you're working with. And I, for one, appreciate your consciousness, and which a good part of that is your humor. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, for also bringing in traditional religion, which has been deplatformed. My work with Richard uncovered, because he joins any religious group, just to see how people access the divine. And he's found a group of young men who were Eastern Orthodox, and through that he discovered Saint Maximus the Confessor, who lived back around 800 AD. And St. Maximus says that our work on the planet as human beings is to unite the cosmos in love. So in those ancient traditions that we poo-poo in favor of science, there are some fundamental truths that need to be dusted off and celebrated. And in doing so, we can make alliances with the traditionally religious, which is going to be what's necessary now.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, Tom has his hand up.
Okay. Again, I've been following you for a long time. You actually visited Tallahassee, Florida at one point or two. And it's good to see you again. I would like a little more specifics on, what is it that they did and do, in Poland, in your India example, in your symbiotic circles. What's actually happening in those that we could learn from and replicate in our creating or using existing groups where we are?
Let me start with Sarvodia, because that's the most enduring. That started in 1958, and so it's really interesting. Here in the West, we lionize Maslow, Abraham Maslow, but I heard an indigenous speaker say that Maslow had it upside down. That at the foundation is our spiritual connection, and so in indigenous societies, everything flows from that bottom piece of the pyramid. We think that once we have everything material handled, then we can relax and meditate and do a spiritual practice. Sarvodia integrated the spiritual practice from the foundation. And when Richard emulated their work in Reno, Nevada, first through the connections gatherings, their intention, Sarvodia created these symbiotic circles. They call them the Sarvodia societies. They created these Sarvodia societies where people could actually practice the virtues, the four Buddhist virtues, be conscious about that practice, and then look at how do we connect the good in our community. So Richard created what was called symbiotic networks in Reno, Nevada, that they weren't nonprofits, they weren't owned by anybody, they were non-institutional, there was no staff, there was no budget, there was no CEO. But he started by gathering, first thing he did was, when they decided to do their local food network, their buy local network, he had a number of people who he knew who were leaders in various communities in Reno. He brought the leaders together, and he felt that he had personal trust with these leaders, so it was essentially a circle of trust. and then presented the idea of a buy local network. And then, what businesses do you know? And they were like four uh, flip charts, and people came up to the flip charts and wrote the names of all of these businesses. Then they invited the businesses to participate, and then they created a committee to develop the platform and program. So what it always started with a purpose, a common purpose: unite the cosmos in love, build a symbiotic circle of that will create a buy local campaign here in Reno. Then you reach out to other networks of trust. There's something called weak links, and weak links are the people who are connected with your network and another network who can introduce you to people that you don't already know, but who would be resonant with what you're presenting. So then the next thing they did, after a very successful buy local network, they had a Valentine's Day meeting. And they had a big, it was at a big community center, and there were a couple of hundred people there. And from there, they decided that they were going to crowdsource principles and virtues to practice, to make this a culture. And there were people who had been in the Marine Corps, and people who had been in religious organizations, secular organizations, and they crowdsourced all of these principles and virtues so that they had a guideline for how they're going to be. The next thing they did, this is something that Sarvodia did. Sarvodia got, now these are people who have no agency at all. They don't count for anything. Nobody's ever asked them anything. They gathered these poor people and said, what are your most important needs? And the people in Sri Lanka who are part of this, they found 12 needs, 12 common needs. And they decided that they were going to use whatever resources they had, their common resource, their willingness to work, their abilities and skills, their ability to work together to access, to begin to address these common needs. And that's what happened in Reno. They had 12 common needs that they came up with. And the first one, the first that they decided to address was local. They created a local food network that enhanced every business related to food. And they went from one community-owned farm network to 300 farms, just by putting the idea in people's heads. There's a lot that I can unpack. If you don't, after the program, I can send you my link, and I can send you a link to the Birthing the Symbiotic Age book. There's a number of videos that explain what Sri Lanka did and what he did. But it's very doable here. All those things are doable.
Great, great. And if you want, you could send it to me and I'll send it out.
That's what I'll do. And, it's really interesting. So many of these organizations that are well-meaning, regenerative organizations, they are only in the domain of theory. They have never, ever, ever been in real-world practice and community. I call that seriousness. They're serious. They're very serious. And so what Richard has done has always involved real people, always involved mainstream communities, mainstream economies. And so in talking to many of these communities, they're only interested in people who believe what they believe. And that is a losing strategy. Yeah. Because then you have to be in the business of selling your point of view, when rather to create a silo, to create a network that brings together the silos, a symbiotic network, which is what they created in Reno.
There's a section in the book that talks about, it mentions Einstein's famous quote about you can't sort of solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. And there's a wonderful story about, how, the section is about how to go to that higher level of consciousness in order to resolve a conflict. And so there was this story about a farmer whose sheep were being attacked by the dogs of a neighbor. And normally this would be, lead to a big conflict. You have to tie up your dogs, and no, I won't tie up my dogs. And it could, end up in a kind of a war. But what the farmer did instead was he gave a newborn lamb to the children of the neighbor. And the children were so delighted in this adorable little lamb. And of course, it had to be protected from the dogs who would eat it. And so the neighbor tied up the dogs to protect the lamb, which their children were delighting in, and they became friends, and and problem solved. So instead of addressing the problem on that lower level, and there were other examples too, which were equally great. The one about Peru and Ecuador,
The border, yeah.
the border dispute, and they were getting nowhere, and so they decided it would belong to both of them, and they built this huge park, and everyone enjoys it, and it's neither Ecuador's solely or Peru's solely. It belongs to both. So that whole stretch of border that was, being disputed became a combined place of.
That was the work of Johann Galtung, who passed a year or two ago. Johann Galtung, his whole idea was, he called it the fifth way. And normally you look at, well, if there's a conflict, either, one way is I win, you lose, you win, I lose. We ignore the problem and hope it goes away, or we compromise where we both lose a little bit. But then the fifth way is the breakthrough solution that creates a win-win for everybody. So he was the one that created that negotiation that led to that common ground, that common, and thank you for reminding me of the sheep story. So I think that one of the problems in the linear world is that we don't recognize that true solutions, evolutionary solutions, are emergent, that compromise is still on the battlefield. It's still on the field of the limitations of what exists. But when you open that up and you go, what are the possibilities beyond this field that are above and beyond at a higher level? I was working with somebody years ago, and we talked about three ways of problem solving. There's transactional, transformational, and transcendent. Transactional is about it's on the symptom level. I got a headache, I take an aspirin, right? Transactional. Transformational is you find out, well, what is really behind that? Why am I getting that headache? Is there a cause? And so that's the transformational. But transcendent is always necessary, I find, to get to make the leap from transactional to transformational. True transformational is always transcendent because it requires seeing it from that higher point of view. You can't transform at the level of the problem, which is transactional, but you can only do it from above the problem, which is transcendent.
Yeah. Anyone else? Jeff?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't see the raise hand button. But
that's okay.
I thought that was a great discussion about how there's a mechanism in the body that kind of coordinates everything and kind of sends the energy to the place it's needed. That's kind of like a loving energy. And you said that that's kind of needed in society, where instead of proper competition, we're all it's a loving energy of what's good for everyone.
Yes.
But it seems to me these days, and you discussed it too, that we're getting more polarized. There's more hatred. It seems like there's more domination energy. Maybe we're just noticing it in this country, It seems like it's more in this country, seems like it's been in other countries. Do you see anything, or do you have any idea what would create the spontaneous evolution to change consciousness in that way? I mean, the book is spontaneous, and I did read your book a couple of years. I was on a previous thing, and I did read your book. But you see, you have any idea what would create a spontaneous evolution? And what was the name of that saint you said you had about the creating love in the cosmos?
The name of the what?
The name of the saint.
Oh, Saint Maximus.
Maximus.
Maximus the Confessor. Yeah. I guess, part of this is have we hit bottom yet? That's what this phase is about. It's about hitting bottom. It's about going the full Monte on our materialist way of being. And again, Margaret Mead did say that a small number of people gathering around a coherent idea can create an idea whose time has come. So I'm finding among my progressive activist friends, for example, that they're realizing that even though resistance is irresistible, it ain't going to do the trick. And so more people are open to the idea of what if we actually collaborated and rehumanized one another? And this is happening. After the Charlie Kirk assassination, there was a group, these are people who are, people who are involved in deliberation and bringing people together, Braver Angels. They did a call with 1,100 people, called just to put it together in 2 days. And these 1,100 people were asking that question. How can we, how do we begin to rehumanize one another? And then the second step that's equally important, collaborate across silo lines for mutual benefit. The book that's coming out next year, Birthing the Symbiotic Age, and again, I will send Gloria a link to Richard's Substack. That is laying out a template for doing it, a five-step program for doing that. So
Great.
please stand by. Okay, thanks for the question.
All right, let's see. We have a couple more minutes if anyone has a quick question, or I don't see any hands up right now. So, Steve, what would be the one thing you'd like people to take from your book, if the most important thing?
Well, the most important thing is that evolution has its inevitability, and there's a certain inevitability about this next phase of human evolution if we allow it to happen, and that this is a time, the first time in recorded history, where evolution is a conscious practice. In other words, it's not something that's happening to us. It's something that we decide to be a factor and a fractal in this evolution, that we can be an agent. And as enough of us cohere together, we can begin to build a community. That's why I so appreciated what Glenn said earlier, that it is happening. And then the most important thing that we can do is to notice when we are being manipulated by a narrative, when we're being brainwashed, when we are being captured, when we're being made to hate somebody else or make them non-human. And personally, my way of doing it is through humor. Unite people through humor. Humorize, humanize, harmonize. That's the three-step program. Get people laughing together about something, about the universal human comedy that we all share, and then all of a sudden, we've humanized that person. We can't demonize them at that point. Our entire political narrative right now is about demonizing the other. Divide and conquer. Our choice, unite and prevail.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks so much for being part of this, and look forward to the next time.
Thank you for holding this conversation, and thank you for offering those questions and thoughts and reflections about spontaneous evolution. Thank you.
My privilege.
Okay.
And here's the book everyone should read, Spontaneous Evolution. Thank you all
Okay.
for attending, and see you next time.
Thank you, folks. Bye.
Bye.